they are. It's, they call this, I think, the home straight. By memory, the home straight is the fastest. So hold on, put it into top gear because we're going to finish fast, and it starts now. Welcome panellists. We have with me Caroline from Medscape Global Medical Affairs, Jennifer from Sanofi, and Thomas from Boehringer Ingelheim. So, just to start off, the medical function in pharma has always been grounded in the science. Yet, when it comes to decision making and purchasing decisions, they've often been guilty of perhaps leaning on gut instinct rather than the hard data itself. There may be some vehicles in the audience who can relate to what I'm talking about. So in this session, what we'd like to do is understand whereabouts medical affairs is currently at when it comes to its data journey. What's the data that really matters? And how shifting from intuition to insights can drive measurable impact, which is what we're really trying to do here for our teams, our HCPs, and most importantly, our patients. So without any further ado, we'll get our experts to dive into the topic. Jennifer, I'd first like to refer to you. We had this quote up here that was provided by yourself, which really encapsulates what we're going to kick off with. Wake up feelings aren't enough anymore. So, is the medical affairs function historically guilty of leaning too much on medical affairs? And where is the industry at when it comes to transitioning to being more data?
Okay, thank you. It's true that up until quite recently in the medical affairs function, there was little data to really show the impact, or little readily available data. So you kind of had to rely on that gut feeling. You know, it wasn't as simple as something like in sales where you've got your sales numbers that you can point to, or an R&D where you can say that you're hitting your clinical endpoints. We were more in the middle about saying things like, we're really making trusted relationships with our stakeholders. And now that's not enough. Even if that is valid, you also need to back that up with data. And now that the data exists, one, there's an expectation that we should be using it. And fundamentally, within medical affairs, we have every interest to actually be using that data. Because, let's look at some of the hard truths. We're all working in a resource-strained organization, and your gut feeling on something is not going to be enough to get you resources, and your gut feeling is not going to be enough to get you budget to continue working on these projects that are so important for us to continue doing. So the gut feeling is important, it's just not enough, we also need the data.
Well, to that, we'd like to lean into a quick Slido poll that will lean on exactly what you're talking about here in terms of using data or using your gut. Can we launch the Slido, please? So we have a question that's going to pop up any moment. That's, for your first mind, will seem quite obvious, but it's going to prove a point, so please participate and take it seriously. Which justification is more convincing for launching a new healthcare professional program? Someone's come into the office saying, the HCP seemed really engaged in our last session, the feedback was so positive, I know that they'd welcome more, which conversations come a lot. Or the pre and post session survey shows a 30% improvement in HCP knowledge of guideline updates. Follow-up program will help close the remaining gaps. So let's have a look. We probably don't need too long here. Okay, somebody's going to gut instinct. It's always a problem. I think that's enough. It proves that point. I'd say overwhelmingly kind of logical for the nature of this presentation or the topic of it. But if it is so obvious, Caroline, why is the process so often lacking? I know you presented recently some information on maps that may be useful to lean on.
Yeah, we did. We ran a short survey at MAPS last week with a majority of medical affairs participants, and we asked them about how they measured the success of their medical affairs initiatives. And actually what was really interesting was that when we asked about practice, they came back and said what we are doing is measuring with standard metrics, participation and reach and so on, but actually what we want to see is behavioural change. So there's a real dichotomy between what people are actually empowered to measure in their organisations versus what they know they really want to be aspiring to demonstrate something's been effective. And we dove a bit deeper into that in a round table conversation. and to try to kind of prize out the reasons, the barriers to that.
Yeah.
And what we're seeing is that, there is significant organisational inertia to making a change. There is a lack of know-how on really, what do you do to measure different aspects. There are, of course, time and budget constraints, and there are limitations in how we can collect the data. So there's a lot of factors at play which seem like a large mountain to move before you can move forwards with. It is deflating to hear, yeah. But I think that what's interesting is that there's most definitely a sense of what we should be doing, but the challenge is how we get there.
Understanding that there is a problem is probably the first step.
Absolutely.
Thomas, it's clear, we just touched on it, that being data-led is critical for the industry if we're going to move forward and provide more value. So from your perspective, what's the, leading on your background in transformation and internal capability building, what's the cultural shift required inside the medical affairs teams to become more data-led, as Caroline's recognised that initial lines?
Thank you, Steve. It's an interesting question, and it helps to understand where we come from as a medical affairs organization. To answer this, medical affairs was created in the 60s as a direct reaction to the perception that pharmaceutical companies have a lack of scientific integrity, and this was really, medical affairs was really installed in the beginning as kind of a support or even a governance function to make sure we have kind of a scientific conscience in pharmaceutical companies that helps us really transmit objective data and not try to persuade or even drive HCPs to do certain treatment decisions. So it helps to have this sort of as a background in mind, and then over the past 20 years, medical affairs has moved more towards becoming a strategic partner in the organization. But the people who are doing the job are still the same, right? So it helps to understand that we have a large transformation need here to actually get also people along this journey towards an objective data-driven organization that is actually aiming towards creating an external impact. Because that was not the case in the beginning, right? They just wanted to support, actually, the purpose was to review presentations, to organize congresses, collect insights, but now becoming more strategic. We want to achieve next impact, and for that we use data and become a data-driven organization so that we can effectively create the impact we want to create.
It's a compelling point. It probably leads us into what is the data that actually matters, recognising that it's important. So, Tom, you had a suggestion for a quick hands-up poll to get everybody, get the blood pumping in the upper body. Please raise your hands if who of you believe that your organisation, or your team anyway, is working in a data-driven way. Your decisions are based on objective data. If you believe that's the case, please raise your hand. Okay, come on. Right, so, okay, keep them up, please. Who of you who do have your hands raised up really has objective, meaningful data, such as something like how you're improving qualified patient journeys, or how well you're impacting the diagnosis rate in your disease state? Gone from 7 to
3.
a bit too long. So, that leads to our next question. Now, I think that kind of reflects the experience of the panel as well. So, we're on the right track. So, in that case, what are the most important data sources in medical affairs today? Are they underused? And the good old vanity metrics, so we're still leaning on them too much, and where are we?
I think so-called vanity metrics are, they're fairly foundational. It's important to know how many people have engaged with whatever you put out there and where those people are. But I think if you want to go further than that, you have to think about the context in which you're measuring, and then actually look beyond that to see what people are doing as a consequence. So, for example, if you ask people at the end of a symposium what they thought of that symposium, most of them are going to say, that was great. But what we're interested in is what they go and do next, their behaviour in the wild, as it were. So what we can see on Medscape, for example, is that if somebody has engaged with conference content, we can see how they seek to expand that knowledge, and therefore we can see what their continuing educational gaps are. we can funnel that understanding into their learning journey. And that goes for our editorial content as well as our pharma-led content. So I think it's really capturing the right data at the right time, and then using that intelligently to apply to your next step of your communication. And with that, then you are liable to see where that's leading much more effectively than just knowing how many people turned up to something.
It seems to make much more sense. I do recall the panel talking quite length about how so many people within the industry are just focused on the big number, the impressions, the reach, and that type of thing, rather than the second. Can you speak more to is this problem in general?
Even just to go off of Caroline's comment, ultimately it's not just how many people showed up at the symposium, but what did they think about it, and what are they going to do with that? What's their behavior? And that's all. That's the all end game. What are they going to do with this information? And I think some of the challenges is that sometimes it takes 3 years to build up to get them to do a certain behavior. For example, if you're launching a new drug, to have KOLs write it into the guidelines, but it takes 3 years of building relationships before you get to that endpoint. So we don't want to just wait until we get that one metric. What we need to do is also show the progression towards obtaining that endpoint. So are we increasing HCPs or KOLs knowledge on the subject? That's the first start before they move to that behavior change. Are they changing their attitudes? And even if we're halfway there, at least we show progression, so that we can still keep going back and asking for the budget, asking for the resources to do more of these kinds of programs to continue moving the needle. So we definitely need that ultimate end-game behavior change objective and metric, but other metrics, intermediate metrics, to show that you're making the progression.
Thomas, you mentioned something critical about the mindset involved in that medical traditionally didn't like to measure at all, and moving away from that mindset to get to these endpoints is still pretty challenging.
Yeah, thanks for pointing it out. I think it's an important point that in medical affairs, measure really almost triggers a defense mechanism of, we are not allowed to measure, we are not allowed to have targets, we don't even want to change behaviors, it's not compliant. And you have to be a bit careful with these statements. In some areas they are correct, and you need to be careful, especially when it comes to trying to change behaviors for MOA or for the asset themselves. But if we actually speak with legal compliance and try to find solutions, then we creatively find that there are many avenues that we can do a lot more than we think we can do. For example, when it comes to this e-state awareness and optimizing patient journeys, making sure that patients get screened if it's appropriate, get under appropriate treatment, and then get into the appropriate treatment pathways to visit the right and refer to the right specialists. All of that is very much possible, even from a medical affairs perspective, and you can even have targets for even be measured against it. So you have to overcome this defensive and this mindset, which comes from the history I just explained, right? Where people really come from. There is a natural awareness of being measured. It's also a bit comfortable to not be accountable for something, right? But if you want to be, let me say this. If you are comfortable with staying a support function and you just do collect insights and organize congresses and do an R, then don't listen to us. It's fine, then you're not going to change. But if you want to be a leader and actually be part of the table, as a table organization, then you need to take accountability for something. And that's really what we need to measure what you're doing and the impact you're doing.
So it's in the consensus, it seems where we're heading is that the narrative, the mindset needs to truly move from metrics to impact measurements. We've spoken a lot about that on the journey from gut instincts all the way through to fully data-led. And I was really interested to hear, Carol, your point on Moore's pyramid that explains the journey and where we're going, how we're getting there.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting when we talk about measurement, because there are tools that are typically used in CME, whereby there's a standard framework for capturing metrics beyond just the participation metrics. It's Moore's pyramid of outcomes. Most people in medical affairs have heard of that, and that is like the guiding principle of a grants office. If they're going to approve a grant request, they have to see that grant is going to, strive to deliver certain outcomes which are stratified according to the Moore's pyramid. And at the sort of the top level of that is, you're moving from participation type of outcomes to knowledge and competence, as Jen said. There's an argument for including confidence in that as well, because we know that if people are confident about what they've learned, they're far more likely to go ahead and do something. And then the sort of the peak attainment, if you like, at level 5 of course is changing performance. Yeah. And then going beyond that, you're looking at kind of impact on patients and so on. Those things are really hard to measure, sorry Steve. But those principles do exist, and it's curious that it exists and it's so well developed in certain parts of organisations, and yet hasn't become, part of the DNA in other activities that medical affairs leads on.
Sounds like just that. I think in itself could be really, really valuable if implemented. We're running low on time, as I knew we would, so we want to, the audience always loves any sort of case study or example of where perhaps, after discussing the data, can you share how using this type of method of looking for impact changed your approach to the HCP engagement or a strategy or initiative? Caroline and/or Thomas may have something. Yeah.
So it's actually really amazing what you can do these days. In the US, you get claims data or health records on an HCP level these days, and you can really understand on an account level the care gaps of a patient. For example, in a specific health system, let's say in the New York area, you have really low diagnosis rates, where it's getting better maybe on the West Coast. This allows you, read on an account level, to target your resources and where you engage with your MSLs and your campaigns to elevate a disease state. And you can even track it over time and measure it maybe on a quarterly basis and see your impact. So there's really so much you can do. The data is readily available. This helps a lot of companies nowadays to accelerate clinical adoption and get more patients on treatment, even already before launch, so that when you then bring your innovation to the market is ready to receive it if you have addressed these challenges in the areas where they are most severe. Just as one example.
Yeah, pretty much like a quick one, Caroline.
Yeah. Okay, just a simple example. I mean, in terms of data capture, we capture data all the time from people using our site, and we use that preference data constantly. So, if somebody engages with short form content, we're capturing that data, and the next piece on their content journey is something that's aligned with that. So we're working with their preferences, and we can pivot what we're doing to make sure that they're getting a journey that is fitting to their own sort of inquiries and their learning gaps and so on, but also kind of tailored to their tastes on site. And I think that's quite a good example of, one size doesn't fit all. And it's really important if you are, you want to embrace this sort of data approach, you've got to be prepared to be flexible at your end with what you're finding. So if you're capturing that data about preference and how people want to engage, then you need to be prepared to serve that. Because if you're not, it's a little bit of a futile exercise.
It leads into the personalisation play too, which is providing more value and really measure the impact once again. So we started with a slide, and we'd like to finish with another slide. We started with a slide that was a quote from a particular thought leader in this space, and we'll finish with a quote from 3 other thought leaders in this space. It's the one take-home message we'd like everybody to embrace, and that is being data-led means not focusing on just the metrics, measuring and understanding the impact. Before we go, we'd like to finish with a quick fire round of questions. I'm going to ask you each, being data-led means not focusing on just the metrics. Sorry, was that the question? One sentence, sorry. If medical affairs teams want to truly be data-driven by next year, what's the first step they need to take? Thomas.
Take accountability and start measuring what you do.
Jennifer.
For me, it's before starting any project, determine how you're going to measure it, and if you don't know how you're going to measure it, then maybe adapt it so that you can measure it.
For me, it's what they said.
Can't finish better than that. Consensus from the panel, ladies and gentlemen. Please thank the panel for this.